Thank you, Jess. Right, okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this quarter's BIM4Housing Operations Working Group meeting. If you don't know who I am, I'm Alex Oldman. I'm the operations team lead, and welcome to this meeting. They're quite large meetings normally, so if as the audience grows, if you want to make a point or ask a question, if you'd like to pop your hand up using the raise button on your Teams meeting, then hopefully we can watch that and come to you for questions and points. This is going to be an interactive session, and the meeting is being recorded so that people who can't make the meeting, who've sent their apologies, for example, can catch up later. George Stevenson has sent his apologies. He would normally be present at this meeting, but I can see from his LinkedIn activity he's at another event. So apologies accepted on that part. I haven't had apologies from anybody else. But that's hopefully so people will join as we go. Okay, so we've got an hour and a half or so, 90 minutes, and to run through some key points. We've actually had some suggestions on discussion points from a member, which is going to be really interesting. So that's going to probably be the bulk of our discussion today. I thought I'd start off with a quick update on the sector that we work in and any significant changes that have been made. This is just notes that I've made over the last couple of months since our last meeting. And again, I welcome additional updates that are relevant. We're going to have a major building safety discussion today, which is going to be focused on 5 or 6 questions raised by David Pote. So that's going to be the main pointer there. Then there's a general update on any other matters, an opportunity for members to update on any interesting projects or progress that you've been making, any information that you feel that you want to share with the group. The point about BIM4Housing really is to have a discussion and to share best practice. And if we don't have an idea on where those best practice might be, to develop an understanding or discussion as a group about best practice operations. So if you've been doing anything in that area, then please hand over. I'm also going to be stepping down next meeting from my role as the operations team lead, having done it for nearly 2 years. I think it's somebody else's opportunity to step forward. So if you're interested in getting involved in the operations working group in more detail, chairing these meetings is the principal responsibility, but also facilitating outside of this connections, making sure that people are networking and talking to the right people. And then there's a good opportunity in there. I'm not stepping back from the group. I'm still going to be very much involved in the group, but I think it's an opportunity for somebody else to pick up. And then on to general discussion for any other business, anything that's going to sit nicely at the end there. Okay, so some quick updates from the world. I haven't actually proofed these slides, so apologies. It's not Thursday, the 8th of June. It's the 26th of September. Sorry about that. People already. The first thing is that back in June and July, BIM4Housing ran a series of roundtables, which resulted in sets of publications, which have now been updated where appropriate on the BIM4Housing.com website. These are the working notes and guidance notes on specific practices. There were, I think, 12 or so meetings which took place. So specific guidance on information requirements around things like automatic opening valves, sprinkler systems, fire doors, for example. So if you're looking for information requirements, data capture and management requirements that are going to help you maintain your properties in good order and manage information sets to demonstrate compliance, then those publications are a good source of knowledge and information to expand on that. I always talk a little bit about mergers. So the only merger that I've spotted is that Stonewater have announced a merger with Mount Green Housing Association back in August, and that's a 1,600 home housing association going into Stonewater. So that's good news. And obviously we've got the looming deadline on the building safety register, which is going to be up next week. So the 1st of October is upon us, and I've seen in the press the last couple of weeks lots of excitement about people making sure that their buildings have been registered in time. So hopefully we can get some updates from the groups or group members on how that's progressing, and are we still, with a week or two to go, are you nearing completion of that process, or have you only just started? Does it seem likely that you're going to meet that deadline? It's always been quite an ambitious deadline. I'll just make a general note that the regulator of social housing has generally been flexing, and Mr. Gove has been stirring things up a little bit with the work that he's been doing in the Department for Levelling Up. And so we are obviously coming under greater regulatory scrutiny, and it seems that those regulators are prepared to use their powers a bit more as well, which I think is a good thing for shaping the industry. And then we're on to the next point. So this is the general discussion point. So I don't know if David's actually had a chance to join this discussion or not, and he's not on the call at the moment. So he framed a set of questions which were for general discussion, and I'm looking to stop presenting and or at least stop talking and open up on these individual points. Which you can clearly read, but all to do with the Building Safety Act and the Fire Safety Act. So which buildings are considered in scope? What are the impact of the recent changes to building control and duty holders that I know Richard's going to be talking about in a bit as well? What about the impact of the competency requirements? And I suppose that talking about the levels of training as well as competency for certification of contractors. What are people doing about the 2 staircases matter, i.e. the requirement for buildings over 18 metres to have 2 staircases? I know that letters have been written to government about that from groups of individuals, but not necessarily from professional bodies. So there's a bit of a tension in there. But what's going to be the impact on, from our perspective, operating these buildings in terms of the requirement for two staircases? And do we have any ideas for David to help around detailed guidance, or the lack of apparently detailed guidance around fire exits and evacuation lifts? I don't know the specific matter sitting behind that, so if he's able to call, or for anybody else who knows him is able to comment on those would be useful. So let's start off with a discussion quickly about which buildings are in scope, and I'm going to stop hogging the screen and just kind of open it up and say simply from a slightly I'm not an expert on this. I'm just the guy that's sitting in the working group here, so chairing things. So my view is that anything over 6 stories or 18 meters is in scope, and I think that's pretty clear. But are there any grey areas or any other matters that would bring a particular building into scope under the Building Safety Act or the Fire Safety Act?
There was actually something raised. Sorry, is my microphone on?
Yes, yeah, Richard, I can hear you loud and clear. You are live.
Sorry,
and on air.
Sorry. Yeah, there was something raised actually on a meeting, I think it was last week, that in the supplementary guidance there was they've changed something to do with the basement ceilings and how far they were allowed to protrude or not protrude. And a lot of people are finding that their basements now counted as a story purely because of that recent change. They're having to count their basement as a story, so suddenly they're up to they've got a lot of extra buildings that are now in scope, which a month ago, 2 months ago weren't. So that's obviously quite a significant move.
Do we know do you know which guidance that relates to? That
detailed? Yeah, I did. It was mentioned in the meeting, and I kind of remember it from the meeting, but it's not something that it was to do with the depth of the ceiling or the floor between the basement and what would be the ground floor. As to if that was protruding slightly the basement, then it would be that basement would now be included as a floor.
As a story. Okay, so
Yeah,
so you've got
sorry,
something
that's it.
above ground level, so it could be just starting a meter
It could
above
just be
ground
a
level.
pocket,
You could
little,
be going
literally
up to
little.
the ground floor up some steps, but that's a story. So now you're
Yeah,
into the 6 stories, even though you're
yeah,
building, you're only counting 5 sets of windows.
absolutely, which it wasn't before. So it's people are having to recount what is
Mm.
actually covered under the Act.
Okay. That's interesting. And the other angle on that, of course, is the 18 meter, which obviously hasn't changed. So, but it's the 6 stories. It's the stories, which is the
Well, I
problem
don't know.
there.
Presumably, they would count that height as well, wouldn't they?
Well, yes, but
Would they count
I'd measure that from ground level no matter what. So the building is this tall from
Yeah,
the floor. I wouldn't
yeah, but
count
would
from
you?
from that line there.
Yeah, but would that be the case if the basement now counts? Would that count as the depth for depth as well? Do you think?
Don't know. Does anybody have any comments on this? What do people do in practice?
I mean, the diagrams that are in approved document B and what was used also for the 11 metre measurements was from ground level, not anything to do with floor and ceiling. So when it comes to the 18 metres, it's the floor level of the highest habitable floor to the lowest ground level. So the basement being counted as a story means that, yeah, as someone said, you could end up with something that you thought was 6 stories is now 7 stories, and therefore is as included as an HRB, because it's either 7 stories or above or 18 metres plus. So yeah, there is that risk that you've got a 6-story building, but the basement is higher, and therefore it becomes a 7-story building, and then falls under the regime. Yeah. It's my understanding anyway.
Okay. I suppose the message then is it comes back very clearly to understanding exactly what measurements you've got on your building and being able to go off and, if you've got a CAD drawing, to be able to go off and actually measure these things with the idea that maybe the rules have changed a bit. So it's going back to that detailed drawings idea of being able to actually go in and measure that information. So okay. I think the second part to that question was also who's going to be doing the reviews. And I don't know which, again, I don't know if David's on the call, but I don't know which specific reviews we're talking about. Are we talking about the initial risk assessments? Are we talking about policy deciding which buildings are actually in scope on the property management side, or something else? What do we understand in terms of who's making the decision on this? Is it the landlord who's making the decision? And I'm assuming that's the case. I'm assuming that the let's go with this. So is it true? Am I correct in thinking that the landlord is going to be making the assumption about the buildings that are in scope and then applying to the building safety register to bring those buildings onto that register? Or is somebody else going to be responsible for that? For example, the local authority or fire service, maybe.
Yeah, so my understanding on this one as well is the principal accountable person that registers the building. I mean, we have a few buildings where we are the responsible person, but not the principal accountable person. So although we're supplying information to the PAP, on our areas of responsibility, the PAP is responsible for registering, and the PAP is responsible for the safety case report.
Okay, and the PAP is self-declared effectively, right? On the basis.
Yeah, sort of. The criteria is the PAP is the person that's responsible for the exterior structure of the building. So you could have someone that's responsible for the maintenance of the interior of the building, like communal areas or flats, etc. But if they are not responsible for the exterior fabric of the building, so the external structure, then they would be classed as a responsible person, not a principal accountable person. At least that's the way we've taken it. Yeah.
Okay. Dave. That's really it's good to have you on the call. Phew. That's really good.
Sorry, yeah. I mean, well, without naming names, there was some buildings where we actually had to go down the legal route to convince them that they were the PAP. So yeah. Hence why I know that I'm fairly on solid ground there. That having had legal advice on it, that we are classed as a responsible person. But it doesn't, absolve of us responsibilities, because obviously we still have to contribute to safety case reports, etc. We still have to deal with mandatory occurrence reporting, compliance issues, all of that sort of thing. But we wouldn't be classed in the letter of the law as the PAP. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think LMA has probably just confirmed that in the chat as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like LMA's made a couple of good comments. Feel free to unmute LMA if you're able to talk. Please do so. Join in the conversation. Yes. What's KBI? Sorry, in this. Oh, okay. No problem, LMA. LMA's on our train. So, key building information. Right. Key building information handed over to register. Okay, excellent. So Steve's asking, I wonder if the question is related to the inspection of the buildings. So, okay, who's responsible for the inspection of the buildings? So we know that the principal accountable person is going to be responsible for pulling together all the information and making the registration with the regulator on the building safety register. But who's actually going to be doing the inspections of those buildings, presumably in terms of risk assessments? Now, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that the responsible parties will be appointing appropriately qualified assessors and contractors to work on the buildings to the required standards.
Yeah, I mean, once again, apologies if I keep jumping in.
That's good, Dave.
So, for instance, with some of our buildings, we're responsible for the fire risk assessment on the building, even though we're not the principal accountable person. But obviously, we would supply the fire risk assessment to the PAP. For instance, if the PAP is responsible for the external walls, chances are for the safety case report, they would commission a structural engineer to provide the evidence, the claims argument evidence stuff to prove that the building's safe from a structural perspective, and then rely on the responsible person where they've got responsibility for certain areas to do either a fire risk assessment or get a fire engineer to provide a report on the fire safety of the building. So.
And how does that actually work in terms of as well on the? Oh, sorry, I think Steve's got his hand up. Steve, do you want to make a point?
Yeah, sure. I've just posted in the chat from the BSR site right now an advert for a fire engineer, and if you look at the salary on there, it's 55 to 60,000, 61 roughly. I don't know any fire engineers that can afford to work at that level. So I'm wondering what quality of inspector we're going to get, frankly. Thoughts, please, people.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Steve. I mean, fire engineers are like the unicorn shit at the moment, qualified ones, and they're being snaffled up by consultancies for vastly inflated, amounts of money, and I can't see anyone sort of taking a pay cut to go and work for the regulator to then go and do inspections based on other people's reports.
My thought is I'm in the wrong business.
Oh yeah, believe me.
But there we go. But yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, yeah, that's it's a matter of supply and demand, I suppose. But it is interesting, isn't it? Interesting opportunity. Okay. Okay, so in terms of so another thought that just pops into my head whilst Dave was talking particularly is that obviously you've got multiple in complex setups. It's likely that most landlords are going to be in complex environments where you've got potentially different responsible parties collecting information and registering. What provisions are people making for either capturing information or sharing information with other responsible parties? And does BIM have a role in this? Are you, how are you going about capturing and sharing the information? So say that you're only a responsible party, but not the principal accountable party in a block. You've got a landlord who's a private landlord, and you're putting tenants into this block and providing a social landlord service in there. What information are you getting from the landlord about the safety of the building, or do you have to effectively double everything up and do all of your own assessments and capture all of your own information?
I mean, for us, I think at the moment the main focus is working out who all those other principal accountable people are for our buildings, because I think first of all we were focusing very much on where are we responsible, and now it's we're not responsible, but who is, and opening up those lines of communication, making sure that they agree that they're responsible, and then trying to open up those lines of communication, because obviously they will expect to receive information in certain forms. We might not produce it in that format, and so it's about opening up those lines of responsibility. Interestingly, I think, like Simon mentioned, there have been a couple of cases where people are like, oh no, we're not responsible, or so and so is responsible, and we don't disagree with them. We don't agree with them. So we've had to have discussions over who is responsible there. But also, yeah, identifying, well, if you're the principal accountable person, how are you going to communicate with us as your leaseholder? How are you going to communicate with us and our residents? And making sure that those lines of communication are open, so that we're understanding and able to pass on those communications if they're only communicating with us and not the residents in the building, which we don't think would be right. But obviously, as private sector managing agents, will often use mailing lists and those types of things, which will always be leasehold led, and therefore that communication directly with resident is a slightly more challenging one for that sector as well. So it's how we deal with that onward communication. So it's very much just opening up those conversations and understanding how each of those parties will work, and hopefully trying to find some coherence, and very much saying, come to us, tell us what you need in order that we can support you in your role. But where we have responsibilities, where we're carrying out fire risk assessments, where we're responsible for internal areas, even if we just have tenants in buildings and they want to know that we're visiting them and carrying out our due diligence with regards to the residential properties that we're responsible for, making sure that we can provide them with those records on demand rather than, I think, just off the cuff. So yeah, I mean, it's communication ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd have to agree, but I mean, that whole resident side of things is definitely one where the responsibilities can be sometimes split, or the PAT doesn't have any communication with the residents. So when it comes to resident engagement strategy, resident satisfaction measurements, resident complaints, all of which are part of the Act, then there has to be an agreement of how those lines of communication are dealt with. Whether it's us talking to the residents but informing the PAT, particularly where there's resident complaints, because that will need to be reported to the regulator at some point. Either they will ask us for stats, or it will come via NROSH or something like that. So.
It's a big thing of interest to me, because I'm about to make the shift. I'm moving from public sector into the private sector at the end of this year, so I'm going to have a whole new perspective on it. So I shall be able to add more later.
That's good. Good luck with the move. That's really interesting.
Mm.
Okay, good. If anybody else has got another point to raise on that, then please let me know. So what in sort of moving on to the next point about impact of changes to building control and duty holders, Richard, are you able to pick up at this point and with your laser display device?
Hi, yeah, I'm actually doing a presentation that I've had sight of for about 10 minutes. It was George was intending to do it, but he couldn't make it. So you'll have to bear with me. Let me just, the initial presentation that George put together was 68 pages, which funnily enough, I'm not going to do that. I've cut it down to 8. So you'll have to, let me just, all right, I've got it. Let me, all right, let me share screens. This is only a small part of question 2, so I'm not going to spend too long on it. I've got a ream of notes for each slide, but there again, I think that I hope they're relatively self-explanatory. Right, so as we know, the Building Safety Act requires a golden thread of information. It's primarily about risks, the implication of those risks, and the challenges those risks present. Clearly, defining the information that's required is of paramount importance. It's also important to verify that information, coordinate and integrate. But how do we make use of it? The Building Safety Act isn't actually coming up with a lot new in terms of what we should be doing, because we should have been doing it anyway. It's more about clarification, though some might query that, and putting it into the format where it's enforceable. So designing in line with building regulations, selecting products that satisfy specifications, recording what was installed and that it was done properly, record when things change. Now, we've all heard at different stages, don't worry, everything will be in the O&M. It will be in the BIM. Regulation 38, building control sign-off. It won't. The reality is, it won't be in the O&M. It won't be in the BIM. So what does the Building Safety Act do to change that? Well, firstly, transferring risk is no longer possible. Responsible and accountable persons, George says effectively the landlord, client responsible persons must confirm information is received. Now, this is an important part because prior to this, my understanding is that the FM had responsibility that they had to ensure that they had the information. Now it's the landlord's responsibility to make sure that the FM has information. The client responsible person must maintain that information. That is a responsibility that's ongoing. And there are penalties, and there are severe, significant penalties. If you look at that, the responsible person must confirm receipt. The Building Safety Act requires you to store information digitally. And this is key. It must be digital. Why? Because it needs to be auditable and validatable and easily updatable. It's manual versus automation. And here's an example of what happens when it's not digital. All the information is on that diagram. But could you extract it? it overlaps and it's virtually useless. Look. There's too much information to check manually. It needs to be automatically updated. Fire door inspections. Have you done a fire door inspection? Yes. What failed? Fire assessments. You've done your fire assessment? What actions? It's like an accounting system. Double entry. Does it balance every day? Now, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to skip through this because it's a little bit. These are from a meeting George had last week. There must be a building regulations compliance statement. And this is interesting at the bottom. Where information is not available, you will have to show what you've done to try and find it. And there, again, as I said, onus on the client, onus on the client. Client submits. Okay. That's what I've got. As I say, it was just a small part of question 2, but George wanted me to raise it.
Yeah, I think David's specific questions, and that was very interesting, but was about changes to the building control, new duty holder roles, specifically 3 client roles, principal designer and principal contractor. So I think that's laid out some of the client duty holder responsibilities. But what about this principal designer and principal contractor new duty holder roles? Do we understand, or is anybody able to elaborate what changes have come about, perhaps recently, that have changed any roles in terms of designers, principal designers or contractors?
I have actually got a short thing, not a presentation, don't worry. I've actually got something on that if I can find it.
Because I'm just trying to work out if it is this, again, it's a shame David's not on the call, but the context of the question, we can put a lot of spin on it. But is this about, have there been changes into, to what were the understood previous ways of operating for principal designers and contractors and the client responsibilities, and have those been understood and communicated?
Can I just read what George I wrote, which I'll read it rather than from what George explained to me. Hackett, coming from an environment where design for projects was undertaken 2 or 3 years before ground was broken, defined the role of principal designer as coming to an end when construction started. At this point, all design work ceased and all responsibility was handed over to the main contractor. Until the design is fully completed, it was not handed over. This completed design was sacrosanct and to be followed to the T. This view was enshrined in CDM 2015. Now, what the Building Safety Act, however, recognises is that crossover is likely and gives a more flexible, if woolly, timeline. When there is still design work being done during the construction phase, then the principal designer still retains the title and the responsibilities of principal designer. So that's the shift. It's kind of a bit of a grey area shift, but there's a very clear shift.
And I note with interest that those responsibilities have been defined since 2022. I don't think there's been any changes in 2023 in terms of health and safety guidance, for example, building safety regulator guidance. I don't know if anything's changed in recent months, say this year. I don't think anything's changed in 2020.
No, not with the supplementary guidance. I don't think any of that's changed, any of that.
Okay. So just going back to the question. So the question that David posed was the impact of changes to building control and to new duty holder roles. So is there anything that's changed in building control in the last few months? I'm sure actually that's probably something that changes frequently on roles in terms of building control. I can't see any guidance or regulation changes using my advanced Googling skills, but this is an area I'm definitely deficient in terms of technical knowledge.
Alex, I think that.
Sorry, Steve, you got your hand up. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Building control, I think, is being phased out for construction of in-scope buildings and being handed over, as I understand it, to the building safety regulator for those buildings. So for the taller buildings, because of the gateway system that's in the Building Safety Act.
Okay, yeah.
So I think for those buildings, it will go over to the HSE as building safety regulator for the taller buildings and into the gateway system for projects that qualify.
Yeah, as high risk residential, as high risk buildings. So
yeah,
as we said previously. Okay. And do any of those? So now we understand that. Thank you. That's a very useful angle on it, obviously. But I still don't think. I think we understand what the roles of the duty holders in terms of the client, the principal designer, and principal contractor. We still understand what those are. Again, I don't think there's any been change since those notes have come out. Trying to think when that guidance has been dropping, but I believe that was before this year, this calendar year, 23. So I don't think we've got any changes there. So apart from the point that Richard's highlighted, which is the sort of the responsibilities of the principal designer continue even once construction commences. You're still the principal designer. So, okay. Does anybody have any more on that particular point before we talk about the impact of competency requirements? So the next point, the third question on this list is the impact of competency requirements specifically and the need for standard work instructions. What are people doing, or how are you satisfying the competency requirements? And what are you doing in terms of issuing work instructions to contractors for regulated buildings now for these high risk buildings? Is anything changing? Are you doing anything differently?
I was going to say, from our perspective, we have set up a contractor portal where basically the contractors fill in the information about the areas that they work in, the staff that work for them, and the competencies of those staff. I think you're right in the fact that there is still a lot more to do from the regulator side of things regarding what those competencies should look like in certain areas, particularly with existing buildings, rather than new builds as such, because new builds have tended to have a sort of competency regime in place anyway. How effective it is another question, but for work on existing buildings, where you've got just standard repairs contractors going in and knocking holes in walls and things like that, that's where there's issues, particularly around things like competency and fire stopping and things like that. So.
Yeah, I think we were fortunate to have recently sort of had a framework in terms of fire safety works and those types of things. So that formed part of our framework consultation process, making sure that there were certain competency requirements that were included within contractor selection and meeting those competency requirements. I think that the bigger challenge is sort of on that day-to-day repairs contractor element, is almost getting them to stop at the point at which they're veering into fire safety works where we won't necessarily have assessed their competency of those individual trades or workers. And I think that's probably actually the bigger challenge. If certainly for our fire actions, for our maintenance, it's much easier to control sort of the contractor use. It is that general repairs area where it's more of a challenge.
And how can contractors demonstrate competencies to you? Are there certifications that you're looking for? Is it a case of, you're looking for them to evidence that they've got systems in place? Are you auditing them at all? How, what do you actually look for? So if I'm a contractor wanting to work on one of your repairs frameworks and I want to get a job, what do I need? What might I need to do in order to demonstrate that? Are there specific are there badges I can get?
I mean, there are. I mean, it is certain qualifications. So, and accreditations for the organisations, for the individuals, but also that ability, that training regime, make sure that everybody stays qualified. So they need to demonstrate the competency of their staff, ongoing training and support to those. But it is very much also that part that the gentleman was just saying, in terms of they need to tell us what they are accredited to do, and understand their limitations as well. Certainly moving forward, we do intend to audit in a certain way. I suppose I don't think we're quite there yet, but certainly the intention is there for sure.
Yeah, and funny enough, as I said, part of the thing that we're doing with our contractor portal is issuing authority to work, sort of permit to work basically. So they tell us the job that they're looking to do, and then we then review that, determine whether we think they're competent to do that job, and then issue an authority to work before they can do it. It's not a catch-all, because you can always have a leaseholder with a BT engineer or a Sky engineer turning up that we don't even know about. So we're trying to put that within QR codes in the buildings to say, if you're coming in to do work, here's the link to the portal, fill in the authority to work form, we'll confirm whether you can do it or not, whether you've got the competency, etc. But as Flo said, with compliance contractors and with new contracts and things like that, yes, competency is very much part of the contract details nowadays. And obviously, for someone who's, you're contracting to maintain fire doors, you're expecting specific, competencies for that. But or AOVs or lifts or anything along those lines. But it is the general repairs contractor that goes in to replace a kitchen fan and then fills the hole, the gaps in the hole with pink foam that's flammable. It's those sort of things that you struggle to catch without putting a process in place.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so I think we've covered off the impact of competency requirements, question 3. Question 4, this one's controversial. Impact of two staircases. So for high-risk buildings, there's an idea at the moment that you might need to incorporate 2 staircases, 2 fire exits into your buildings. Yeah, that's an interesting one. So what are people doing about that?
I mean, on that, we've issued a directive that on every new scheme, we expect there to be 2 staircases on every building over 18 metres, unless there is an incredibly good reason as to why it can't be achieved, as in it's already poured or like the ground floor is already, I mean, we've even gone to the extent of we've had to pause a plant room adoption to an ESCO in order to be able to retrofit a second staircase to a building which is mid-construction, which is extremely disruptive. But we think it's the right thing to be doing. So that's what we're doing.
That's really interesting. Anybody else on buildings under construction or under design at the moment? Is anybody not doing that? Is anybody carrying on regardless that you want to fess up? Bearing in mind the meeting is recorded and available on the website. No, okay. I'll take confessions later. But then also, so I'm interested in then what about retrofit? So what about existing in 99% of buildings already exist, right? So what are we doing about those? Does the guidance apply to those buildings? And what can you do to accommodate that requirement?
We're not retrofitting.
No. I guess it's a case of having a sensible risk-led discussion to say, okay, what if as part of the fire safety case, you're putting forward the reasons why evacuation down the main stairwell is going to be possible, or if that area becomes not available, then presumably we're back to other mitigating strategies, whatever that might be, however you design those controls.
I mean, it does push, certainly on new schemes, it does push the sort of the criteria for financial viability quite considerably, having to accommodate a second staircase. I don't think we've come up against a scenario where a building has sort of risk assessment has required us to put in a second staircase. I mean, I'm assuming that probably could potentially come out of a building safety case, that actually if you find you don't have adequate provision to evacuate safely due to the size, I think it would
other
probably
issues.
Yeah. So
yeah. Okay. I think it only does relate to new builds anyway. But that's really interesting. So and I'm seeing in the detail, I'm also trying to work out if there's a gap between the 18 meter and possible 30 meter rule. I'm just trying to see if I can look about that. There might be a potential. I think the original proposal was for buildings over 30 meters to have a second staircase, so it might not be necessary for me to for properties up to 30. Has this actually made this through into? So
no,
this is all
I
sort
don't
of proposals.
think it's actually 100%.
It's actually required yet.
No, it's talked about, but we made a decision internally to basically go with the expectation that we needed to have 2 staircases over 18 meters, and so everything that we're doing. Where it's become more of a challenge is on sort of section 106 opportunities for purchase, where you're kind of obviously it's a done deal to a certain extent, in that there isn't quite the same flexibility if there is no second staircase for them to explore it. But what we are looking at there is opening up cross corridor access into other cores and that type of thing. And that's something that we're looking at in our other buildings, where you do actually have the opportunity to have that cross corridor traffic, to see if that's something that we can explore.
Okay,
but obviously it's very much dependent on design. So
yeah. Okay. So the interesting takeaway from there was your point about the kind of looking at the viability of buildings, of projects, on the basis that they, the numbers might not work, simply might not work for the density that you need for properties, for rental income versus, for income, versus the floor space taken up by those additional staircases. Okay, so the last one here is the lack of detailed guidance around fire and evacuation lifts. Around the detailed guidance for provision and operation of fire and evacuation lifts. So now, interestingly, I don't think we've got a working group publication on BIM4Housing about lifts. I'm just going
No,
to
we
double check
haven't,
the
Alex.
list.
It's been mooted a number of times, and we're trying to get something done this year. But to be honest, we've been so full up with the roundtables for the
Lots of other
existing
things.
stuff.
Yeah.
That's not
Well,
actually been done yet, but it is on the agenda to do, believe me.
Okay, and it's interesting because I was at a local authority in the last couple of weeks visiting a customer, and it was a council headquarters building, and I noticed that they had these recycling bins for batteries, which were clear plastic towers, and they were placed between or by the push button above the lifts to call two lifts. So basically in the lift lobby, and the guy I was with we were talking about building safety, and I said, well, I'm not a fire risk assessor, but I'm looking at that massive load of batteries that you've got there, thinking that's not a good place. That's really not a good place to have that particular recycling facility. Well, exactly, in the event of fire. So and then about lithium batteries, for example, being a potential problem if somebody puts those into that kind of thing. So if they get crushed or damaged, and there's definitely an issue there. But specifically around fire and evacuation lifts, so I don't think there is any guidance around this. I mean, it's a very good point, but again, it might be something that we can pick up as a group and perhaps provide some recommendations on what those should be. Does anybody have any specific technical knowledge on fire and evacuation lifts that they might want to share that's any different to standard passenger lifts or cargo lifts? Okay, not for this group, but if we do a round table on that sounds like that would be quite useful stuff. Okay, so that was a really I found that a very interesting discussion anyway. I think I've learned quite a lot from that. So thanks, David, for your suggestion on those specific discussion points. So we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is simply updates from group members. So does anybody want to share anything that you've done in the last 3 or 4 months regarding building safety, fire safety, asset information management, and the use of BIM data or asset information generally to satisfy these requirements? Have you moved anything on this summer? I know things generally slow down a bit over the summer anyway. And also particularly around getting stuff through the process to register with the regulator of with the building safety regulator for these registration of new buildings. Has anybody successfully been through the process of registering a building yet? Is anybody still struggling with that process? Has anybody got any stories they want to share?
Shall I have a go?
I'll tell you what, Steve put his hand up first.
Oh,
Steve
yeah,
first,
yeah,
then Dave will come back to you. Nothing personal. Steve, fire away.
Hi, yeah. Just payment issues been a real pain. We couldn't make the credit card system work at all. And when they came out with the invoicing requirement, my own local government authority has a criteria because of a near fraud incident where they need something separate to just the details on the invoice, because if you fraudulently provided an invoice, a fake invoice, you could put your own bank details on there, which is what the near fraud incident was. The regulator is a little inflexible about that because they are, of course, the central government. So they just say, well, no, we've told you what to do and we've given you our details. Your policy isn't our problem, sort of thing. So we're trying to work through that impasse at the moment. I'm adding my apologies to Fleur because I've got to jump off for a 12 o'clock, I'm afraid, in a second. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has had payment issues. What I've just done is logged a list of the attempts to get it resolved and the conversations with the regulator. So if they come back to us and say, why haven't you completed your registration on time? That is the only barrier. And it's a new thing. I think that they've got different different bank account details for this part of the HSE to other parts that we have on our systems. So maybe a little flexibility on their side wouldn't go amiss. I don't know.
Okay, and the payments in question, this is a fee to use the service to make the registration. Is that what we're talking about?
Registering each building, yeah, you have to register each building separately. It's £251, separate invoice per building. You can't just group them together.
Yeah.
And they all have individual references, so it's kind of, you know, a little more labour intensive depending on how many you got. But that's one of the issues for sure. Generally, there's good definitions on the site. Just personal comment, I'd say there's reasonable definitions on the site, and there's also a sort of don't know. Obviously, if you put don't know, you're going to have to explain why you don't know about your buildings and what efforts you've made, as was previously been covered. Guys, I'm gonna drop off now.
That's fine. No,
thanks for your time. Cheers.
That's all right. Thanks for your input. Thanks, Fleur, as well. Dave.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things. I'm just following on from what Steve said, although he's gone now. Yeah, it was a pain. We registered all our buildings, including doing the secondary registration bit, where we provide more details. Yeah, we had to basically, the guy who was doing all the registration, who had all the details to put into the form, had to go and get someone else who had a corporate credit card to then go and do the payment bit. Which is a pain in the proverbial backside. Yeah, but we've managed to register all the ones that were the principal accountable person, so we've got that done. We also managed to meet the NROS deadline for the 11 metre plus stuff, yeah, which was the 15th of September. Couple of other things. For those of you that haven't registered already, or want to know the questions, there is a template floating around which a company called One Engage provided for free. Funny enough, I heard about it after we'd already done our registration, but there is a template floating about if that's any good, people. Couple of other things. From my perspective, one of which we're doing an exercise with Active Plan at the moment, where we're taking one of our new builds and basically getting all the information together in order to have that all in one place. And as the slides which George provided that Richard talked you through, it is a complete pain in the backside as well, because you know, finding missing information, you know, doing a gap analysis and finding out that the manuals don't hold the right information, or if they hold the information but against the wrong unit, all this sort of stuff. So, yeah, it's a far bigger task than people, you know, may think. So yeah, a couple of other things from my perspective which people may be interested in. So I've been testing, so the HSE have got a couple of portals which they're trying to get off the ground, strangely before the 1st of October, and they ain't going to do it, I can tell you. One of which is around registering a building, making changes to a building, turning a high-risk building into a high-risk building, constructing a high-risk building as a staged application, or applying for multiple high-risk buildings under one application. I tested the portal, and they had a brilliant function on it where they had to send you a verification code once you logged on. The verification code lasted a minute, and it took 10 minutes to come via email. So by the time you got the email with the verification code, it was no longer valid. So I'm waiting for them to fix that, but sufficient to say, with a week to go, I don't think that's going to be live in time. Similarly, I'm also going to be testing the mandatory occurrence reporting portal, and I'm not even going to see a wireframe of that until the 19th of October. So there will be nothing in place on the 1st of October to cover off the mandatory occurrence reporting. So although that's part of the Act, and you know, we've taken steps to get the process in place for doing that internally. So, but there will be nowhere to report it. You know, at least I'm guessing until at least November, December time. So, yeah, yeah, and I think that's probably my updates. Yeah, which may be of interest to other people.
Yeah, that was good. Just going back to your template, One Engage, is that I'm going to put a website in the template that you talked about that was floating around the place. I found what I think is probably the organisation you're talking about, which I put into the chat. If you'd just like to verify that, David, that's really good. LMA's just put a comment in the chat, which I think is an update. There we go.
Yeah, that's the one.
LMA's using.
Yeah.
Okay. And Alex, just going back to your question, first of all, great name. Secondly, what software are others using to record information for high-rise buildings? Well, Dave's using Active Plan, as he's mentioned. I know Gis will be advocating that as well. He works for Active Plan. But I don't know if others on the call are using other systems. It would be slightly remiss of me not to mention Civica. That's who I work for.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, that's one of the things that, which is another bit I forgot to mention. So I'm doing a little bit of work with the HULC around collecting information for the golden thread, and defining what sort of information we'd need to make available. And one of the things that we will find is, whereas obviously some of it is in document format, some of it is in data format. So, for instance, servicing and inspection sits in Keystone with us, as Alex well knows, and there is no APIs that can link that to, say, a SharePoint or a Dynamics or anything like that. So for that sort of thing, we'd have to pull out and export into a CSV or a PDF and supply that on a regular basis to our central golden thread repository, wherever that ends up sitting, so that we can provide that information in a document type format to the regulator or to anyone that needs to see it, to say, look, here's our our planned maintenance on fire doors, here's our planned maintenance on AOVs for this building, etc. And then obviously recording where inspections have taken place and when they haven't taken place, on within the timescales that they're supposed to be meeting. So yeah, so it's never going to be as much as, and I think the HSC, to be fair, have said they're not expecting people to have one system that does it all. They understand that there's multiple systems going to be involved, but from a internal process perspective, you've got to know where that information is held, in which format it's held, and be able to supply it at the drop of a hat if it's asked for. So basically, you sort of have to assess where all the information is, which systems it's in, what format you can get it out in, and where you're going to stick a repository that the regulator can access in order to pull that information at a point of calling or at the point of an incident, etc. So,
okay. I'll just say, just from a Keystone support perspective, there is an API available if you need it, Dave. Give us a call. We can talk to you about that. Rather than extracting stuff to CSVs and PDFs.
Yeah, cool. I can speak to you about that.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so any other software or systems that people are using to record this high-rise information internally, apart from spreadsheets? No. Okay. Okay, good. Right. So I think, unless does anybody have any more updates on work that they've been doing? I've seen LMA's note in the chat as well. Okay, so In which case, let's just quickly talk about the opportunity, the fantastic opportunity you've got to become the next team leader for the operations group in here. As I said previously, at Christmas I'll have been doing this 2 years. And I said I'd just do one. So the second year has all been a delightful extension of the chairmanship. The responsibilities don't stretch much further than chairing these meetings. The topics of discussion, areas of activities are driven by a number of people across the group. Just generally speaking, I've been involved in BIM4Housing, I think now for 5 or 6 years, and through that time I've always got out of it what I put into it, which is to say, if you get more involved, then you can definitely get a lot out of it. And I know that there's certainly regular contributors on this call today, so thank you for joining in. If you are interested in helping out, then please get in touch with either myself, Richard Giz, or George Stevenson, and we can certainly talk to you about what's required, and I'll help you through. I'm going to continue involvement in the group, but I just thought I'd give the opportunity for someone else to steer the charge. So you don't have to volunteer now if you don't want to. I then just want to talk about sort of any other business. Is there anything that anybody else wants to talk about before we talk about dates of next meeting? Gis, I don't know if we've got that sorted yet.
Yeah, could I just say, this meeting we've just had is kind of preparatory to a big meeting we've got on the 23rd of November. We've got as guesting on that a guy who is an advisor to the Levelling Up Committee. So a lot of the grey areas and issues that are unclear with the Building Safety Act, and particularly with the secondary legislation that's coming through, if we can pull that together into something digestible, he will actually pass that through directly to the committee. So it gives us a very good in to actually get something tangible from government, with our influence, if you like. So it's remember that date, 23rd of November. We're getting invites out, but and also if you come up with anything in the meantime that is really a bugbear to you, let us know, because we can get it all down and up for discussion on that day.
If it makes any difference, that's also 23rd of November is the second day of Homes UK and Unlock Net Zero Live at the Excel Centre in London. If anybody's going to that, there's a lot happening that day. I've got 2 family birthdays as well.
Of course we would choose that day then.
Of course you would choose that day. No, that's fine. That's it's a good day. It's a good day if you're not.
Unlock Net Zero Live should be an interesting one.
Yeah, what happens then? Just bring your own gas mask.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so we'll see what happens there. Okay, 23rd of November, so that's a good date for the diary. And the next meeting, Gis, have we arranged a date? I'm looking at my December diary, or is it a January meeting? Maybe that's where I've gone wrong. Have we got a date for the next meeting? Not in place yet. I think we'd be looking to do one in about another 4 months' time, so 16 weeks or so. So we'll probably be looking into the new year for the next meeting. To go through, so watch this space regarding the invite for the next meeting, and we'll I'll lead into that one and then hand over at that meeting, if that's okay. All right, so I think it's a wrap.
Cool.
Thank you very much for everybody's contributions. It's been a good discussion as usual. And yes, we will keep in touch, keep networking, keep communicating. We'll see you on the 23rd, if not before. And yeah, stay safe. Cheers for now.
Cheers,
Cheers,
Bye,
everybody.
Bye.
Yes, bye.
Right.